In September 2013, the president of China stood in Kazakhstan and announced something that almost nobody in the West paid attention to. He called it the Silk Road Economic Belt, a network of roads, railways, ports, and pipelines connecting China to Central Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas. 1 month later, speaking in Indonesia, he announced the second part, the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, a network of sea routes and port investments stretching from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean, through the Suez Canal and into the Mediterranean. Together they became known as the Belt and Road Initiative, or simply the BRE, and by the time the West started paying serious attention, China had already signed agreements with over 150 countries, had already lent more than $1 trillion, had already built railways, highways, ports, and airports across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, without a single military operation, without a single shot fired, using only one weapon, money. This is the story of the most ambitious geopolitical project of the 21st century, and how it is reshaping the balance of global power in ways that will outlast every trade war, every tariff, every election. To understand why China built the Belt and Road, you first need to understand where China was in 2013. After 30 years of extraordinary economic growth, China had become the world's second largest economy. Its factories produced goods consumed on every continent. Its ports handled more shipping volume than any country on earth. But China had a problem. A serious, structural, existential problem. Its entire economy depended on trade routes it did not control. The vast majority of China's oil imports passed through the Strait of Malacca, a narrow waterway between Malaysia and Indonesia that is only 2.8 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. A waterway that the United States Navy could close in a matter of hours if relations between the two countries deteriorated seriously. Chinese strategists called this the Malacca Dilemma, and it kept them awake at night. Because a China that cannot move its goods and cannot receive its energy imports is a China that cannot feed its population, cannot power its factories, and cannot sustain the growth that had made the Communist Party's rule legitimate. The Belt and Road Initiative was China's answer to the Malacca Dilemma. Build alternative routes. Build them on land where the US Navy cannot reach. Build them through countries that will become economically dependent on China. Create a network so vast, so interconnected, so embedded in the global economy that cutting China off becomes not just difficult but impossible. This was not charity. This was not development aid. This was strategic infrastructure investment on a scale the world had never seen outside of wartime. The Marshall Plan, the American program that rebuilt Europe after World War II, disbursed roughly $13 billion over 4 years. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $170 billion today. The Belt and Road Initiative disbursed over $1 trillion in its first decade, more than 8 times the Marshall Plan. And unlike the Marshall Plan, which gave grants that did not need to be repaid, the Belt and Road gave loans. Loans that generated interest. Loans that created obligations. Loans that, when a country could not repay them, gave China something the Marshall Plan never sought: leverage. Here is how a typical Belt and Road deal worked. A developing country needs a port, or a railway, or a power plant. It does not have the money to build it. Western institutions like the World Bank or the IMF would lend money, but they attach conditions, transparency requirements, environmental standards, governance reforms, conditions that governments sometimes find politically inconvenient. China offered something different. Loans without conditions, infrastructure without lectures, no requirements on human rights, no demands for democratic reforms. No insistence on competitive tendering for construction contracts, just money and a contract. The contracts themselves were where the complexity lived. Research by Aid Data, a development finance research lab at William and Mary University, obtained and analyzed hundreds of Chinese loan contracts that had previously been kept secret through non-disclosure agreements. What they found was striking. Many contracts contain clauses requiring borrowing countries to keep the loan terms confidential. Some contain cross-default clauses, meaning that if a country defaulted on any one Chinese loan, all its other Chinese loans could be called in simultaneously. Some granted Chinese lenders priority over other creditors in the event of default, and some contained clauses that effectively gave China informal influence over the borrower's economic policy decisions. These were not the terms of development aid. These were the terms of commercial lending designed to maximize leverage. And the countries that accepted them were often the ones with the fewest alternatives. The story of Zambia illustrates the pattern precisely. China became Zambia's largest creditor through a series of infrastructure loans. When Zambia's economy deteriorated and debt repayments became unmanageable, China held more leverage over Zambia's fiscal decisions than any other creditor on earth. Zambia defaulted on its external debt in 2020, the first African country to do so during the pandemic. Its negotiations with all creditors, including China, took 3 years to resolve. Sri Lanka is the case that generated the most attention globally. China financed the construction of Hambantota Port in southern Sri Lanka, a port that independent analysts had warned was unlikely to be commercially viable. The port failed to attract enough shipping traffic to service its debt. Sri Lanka, facing financial crisis, agreed in 2017 to lease the port to China for 99 years in exchange for debt relief. China now operates a strategic port in the Indian Ocean, one of the most geographically significant waterways in the world, without firing a single shot. Whether this was the deliberate intention of the original loans is genuinely debated by researchers. Some argue it was planned from the beginning. Others argue it was opportunistic. What is not debated is the outcome. By 2025, developing countries owe China a record $35 billion in annual debt repayments. $22 billion of that comes from the 75 poorest countries on Earth, countries that in many cases are being forced to cut spending on health and education to service debts owed to the world's second largest economy. China has transitioned, in the words of the Lowy Institute, from being the world's largest provider of development finance to being the world's largest bilateral debt collector. In 2012, China was a net drain on the finances of 18 developing countries. By 2023, that number had risen to 60 countries whose repayments to China now exceed what they receive in new loans. The infrastructure was built, the loans were signed, and now the bill is coming due. At the same time, 80% of China's government loans to developing countries went to nations already in debt distress. Not because China was unaware of the risk, but because distressed borrowers have fewer options. And fewer options means more leverage. That is not charity. That is strategy. Here is the question worth asking at this point. If the Belt and Road Initiative is so clearly a tool of strategic leverage, why did so many countries sign up for it? The answer is uncomfortable for Western governments to admit. Because for many developing countries, China offered something that Western institutions genuinely were not offering. Financing for infrastructure that the World Bank and Western governments had decided was too risky, too expensive, or too politically complicated to support. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is the largest single buoy project. Over $62 billion of investment in roads, railways, pipelines, and power plants connecting Western China to the Pakistani port of Gwadar on the Arabian Sea. For Pakistan, those power plants ended chronic electricity shortages that had been strangling its economy for decades. For China, Gwadar gives direct access to the Arabian Sea, bypassing the Malacca Strait entirely. The China-Laos Railway opened in December 2021, a 414-kilometer high-speed line, connecting the Chinese border to the Laotian capital Vientiane. For a landlocked country with almost no rail infrastructure, it transformed connectivity with regional markets. For China, it created a direct rail link toward Southeast Asia and eventually, through planned extensions toward Thailand and Malaysia. In Africa, China has financed railways in Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, and Angola, ports in Tanzania, Djibouti, and Cameroon, power plants in Zimbabwe, Ghana, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Djibouti port is particularly significant. China's first overseas military base opened in 2017, sits adjacent to the Chinese-financed commercial port in Djibouti, the same small country that hosts the United States' only permanent military base in Africa. China and America, operating bases side by side in a country of under 1 million people, at the entrance to the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. That is what infrastructure investment as geopolitical strategy looks like in practice. In Europe, China bought the port of Piraeus in Greece in 2016, the largest port in Greece and one of the largest in the Mediterranean. It is now the primary entry point for Chinese goods entering Europe. Managed, operated, and owned by a Chinese state company. Italy became the only G7 nation to formally join the Belt and Road in 2019. It withdrew in 2023, under pressure from the United States and the European Union. But the trade relationships that the BRI created do not disappear, simply because a government withdraws from a memorandum of understanding. The ports, the railways, the contracts, the supply chains, those remain. And this is the deepest strategic insight of the Belt and Road Initiative. Physical infrastructure lasts for generations. A port built by Chinese capital and operated by a Chinese company does not stop being Chinese influence simply because political relations change. The infrastructure embeds the relationship in concrete and steel, long after the politicians who signed the agreements have left office. There is a historical parallel that illuminates this perfectly. When Britain built railways across India in the 19th century, those railways were designed to serve British commercial and military interests, to move troops quickly, to extract resources efficiently, to connect ports to markets in ways that benefited London, not Calcutta. The railways outlasted the British Empire by decades. India still uses them. China studied that history carefully, and the Belt and Road Initiative is its answer to the question of how you build infrastructure that serves your interests long after the initial investment has been repaid. By 2025, the Belt and Road Initiative has entered a new and more complicated phase. The era of massive lending is over. New Chinese loan commitments have fallen to around $7 billion per year. Less than a quarter of the peak lending levels of the mid-2010s. China is no longer primarily in the business of building the network. It is in the business of collecting on it. And that transition is creating pressures that Beijing did not fully anticipate. The debt crises in Sri Lanka, Zambia, Ghana, and Pakistan generated exactly the kind of international attention that China had spent years trying to avoid. The phrase debt trap diplomacy became a standard part of Western political vocabulary. European governments became more resistant to Chinese infrastructure investment. American pressure on allies to avoid BRI participation intensified. And developing countries that had borrowed heavily began to push back. Malaysia restructured its East Coast rail link, reducing China's financial stake. Thailand reduced Chinese capital participation in its high-speed rail project. Indonesia began debt restructuring talks over the Wush high-speed rail line, which had been built with Chinese financing and was struggling to service its debt. China, for its part, has adapted. New BRI projects are smaller, more targeted, and more carefully structured to avoid the reputational damage of large visible failures. The focus has shifted toward digital infrastructure, 5G networks, data centers, cloud services. Across 1/3 of all BRI countries, China is now building the digital infrastructure that will determine how data flows, how communications are managed, and how governments monitor their own populations. Infrastructure that is invisible in a way that railways and ports are not. And that may ultimately be more strategically significant than any physical project. There is also a new focus on critical minerals. As the world transitions away from fossil fuels, the minerals needed for electric batteries and renewable energy technology have become the new strategic resource: lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel. China has secured supply agreements with the Democratic Republic of Congo, Argentina, Brazil, and Indonesia, countries that control much of the world's supply of these materials. The pattern is the same as the original Belt and Road: loans and infrastructure in exchange for preferential access to resources. But the resources in question are not oil and gas anymore. They are the materials that will power the economy of the next 50 years. Here is the question that this raises for anyone watching from the outside. When historians look back at the Belt and Road Initiative from 50 years from now, how will they describe it? As a development program that lifted millions out of poverty by building infrastructure that Western institutions refused to fund? Or as the most sophisticated geopolitical expansion in modern history? A project that used loans and infrastructure to build influence, create dependency, and reshape global power without a single military confrontation? The honest answer is that it is both. And the fact that it is both is what makes it so difficult for Western governments to respond to effectively. You cannot simply oppose infrastructure investment in poor countries. You cannot tell governments that have chronic electricity shortages to reject the only financing offer on the table because of geopolitical concerns that feel abstract compared to lights that do not work. What you can do is understand the pattern. Understand that when a country accepts a loan with opaque terms for infrastructure with questionable commercial viability, the debt that results is not accidental. That the leverage that follows is not an unfortunate side effect. That the port leased for 99 years is not a coincidence. The Belt and Road Initiative is the most important shift in the global balance of economic power since the Bretton Woods system of 1944. It is happening now. It is documented. And most people who will be affected by it have never heard of it. That is what this channel exists to change. Subscribe, because the next video continues this story into the financial systems that China is building to make the Belt and Road permanent, and what that means for the dollar, for trade, and for the world you live in.